Scott's Geography Notebook. Do you want to try saying it?
Da, da, da.
So we understand climate as our long-term patterns. We understand a climograph, how it gets plotted and created. I'd like to talk a little bit about interpreting a climograph. When we look at a climograph, there's a lot of different things that we might see. Right? We're going to see different temperature lines. We're going to see different precipitation lines. And as we can understand these a little bit better, we can come to figure out where in the world they're located. So let's talk a little bit about a few different things. First, we want to take a look at overall temperature. Is that temperature line overall pretty high, or is it fairly low? Right? Temperature is mainly on these guys dictated by the latitude. There is some influence on elevation, but we know that equatorial areas are going to be hot, and we know that polar regions are going to get colder. And then we have this range in between, whether we're in the subtropics or whether we're going to be in the mid-latitudes, or we're even in our subpolar region. There's going to be this progression from one to the other. Right? The other thing that is interesting that we can see on our climograph is temperature range. Right? So what we're going to be looking at is how steep is that line? What's the difference between the coldest temperature and the warmest temperature? The coldest temperature versus the warmest temperature. Right? So how do we dictate those? Well, this is going to be a small temperature range. This is going to be a pretty extreme temperature range. And there's a few patterns that we can see globally based on this. Okay? In our polar regions, latitude is going to be one of our controlling factors. So in terms of latitude, our equatorial areas are going to have very little range. In our equatorial areas, summer is hot and winter is hot, and we don't see a huge difference between those two. However, in our polar regions, there is a very significant range. Okay. The other thing that's going to be influencing this is proximity to the ocean. Proximity to water. We know that in our maritime areas that water is going to be making it a little bit warmer in the wintertime and a little bit cooler in the summertime. And so for close to water, if we have a maritime influence, then we have a lower range. The difference between the high and the low, the summer versus the winter, is going to be less. We know that when we are further inland, or continental effect, that we're going to have a greater range. Right. The other thing that we want to also look at is our precipitation patterns. Right? And to review that guy, it's probably important that we reflect back on our global circulation model. Right? So we were looking at this guy in one other video that we made, and we saw that in the equatorial area, they get a lot of precipitation. Right? We also know that at the subtropical area, the subpolar area, there's going to be a lot of precipitation, but in the subtropics, it's usually going to be pretty dry, and at the polar regions, it's going to be pretty dry. Okay? Let's also remember, though, that these lines, this spot that gets the greatest amount of solar energy, the hottest location, it shifts. And so do each one of these pressure systems. So sometimes it's going to be 0 there. That's going to be the hottest time. But other times, it's going to shift a little bit. And then other times, this is going to be in the southern hemisphere. So those are going to shift a little bit as well. Right? For us in the mid-latitudes, that means that we're influenced in our summer by the subtropical high-pressure system, and in our winter by the subpolar low-pressure system. That's going to be the pattern that we start to see where we are. However, regardless of where you are on the Earth, as we start looking at climatic information, we're going to start to see some changes based on that precipitation. So, for example, here we're looking at an area that overall is going to be pretty warm. It's got a pretty significant range, and when it's warmest, that's when it gets the greatest amount of precipitation. And that's going to be a special area. If it's warm, it's going to be down in this region. If it's getting precipitation when the temperature's the highest, that's going to be like a monsoonal seasonality. And we talked about that back when we were talking about our temperature trends. For our seasonal winds are going to be influencing that monsoonal seasonality. Here's another location where the temperature has very little change and it's going to be very, very warm. Equatorial area. However, only during certain times of the year do they get precipitation and other times they get none. Where we would see that is going to be kind of about right here, because sometimes they're going to have the low pressure system directly overhead, so they'll be getting that precipitation. Other times they're going to have that high pressure system over, and it's going to be very dry. Okay? And so our overall patterns that we start to see with our precipitation is we need to think about our low pressure systems. That's going to be our equatorial, as well as our subpolar, because where it's low, precipitation will flow. And then the other thing that we do also want to pay attention to is this change that we start to see. So seasonal variation. There is this range, if you remember, Earth tilts at 23.5 degrees. So during the year, these zones could shift as much as 47 degrees, 23.5 degrees north, 23.5 degrees south. And so we want to pay attention to our seasonal variation that we're going to see for our precipitation patterns as well. As we reflect back on these, this region right here has a pretty average temperature. Lows are going to be in the 50s. Warmest temperatures are going to be in the 80s. With precipitation in the coolest time of year. This should look familiar to those of us here in the Sacramento Central Valley. This is going to be a climograph for Sacramento. This region right here, we see our temperatures getting lower and our temperature range getting higher. The warmest months are just over 50. And so, overall temperature is cold, and it's polar with a very large range, with relatively low amount of precipitation, however it'll be throughout the year. That's going to be one of our higher latitudes, sort of subarctic regions. This one we talked about already is our monsoonal seasonality, and this one is going to be what we see just outside of our tropic area. It's sort of our subtropical, or the type of climate that you'd find in the Sahara. Not in the Sahara, but in the savanna.